Visited by Hatman 16 years ago. I only just discovered that Hatman is famous. Not going to lie, it's kind of freaky. My encounter was terrifying, and it really got to me. I'm 35 now, but I was 19 at the time. I was sleeping beside my then girlfriend at her family's house. It was late at night, and for some reason, I woke up and had an absurd thought. Imagine if something comes through the door now and attacks me. I try to dismiss the ridiculous thought, and as soon as I settle my mind, in pops Hatman. Hatman briefly stands in the bedroom doorway and looks at me. I am in a state of paralysis and cannot move. He then quickly darts over to my bed and peers over me, face to face, for a second before physically throwing me across the room onto the floor. While I'm on the floor, I immediately feel excruciating pain in my feet. I grasp them because of the pain, and when I look at them, I see large balls moving through my veins and going towards my feet. Anyway, then I was woken by my girlfriend, screaming with tears streaming down my face. I was convinced it was a spiritual attack by some demonic force. My girlfriend's house was a bit of a drug den, with her parents being into dark magic, so that fed the narrative that it was an evil spirit. I had another bizarre dream a few days later, where I was paralyzed, but this one did not feature Hatman. I have never seen him since, and pray I never do. Camp Hatman. I'm a 42-year-old male and recall seeing him when I was around 14. I attended a summer program where middle schoolers would stay at a college campus and take AP classes for college credits. I was wide awake and lying on a loft bed, lights out, with my two roommates, who were on their own loft beds. My roommate says, "What was that?" We looked over, and right in front of the door was this huge, tall shadow with a fedora-style hat. Couldn't make out any features. We were so scared, but we couldn't leave because he was in front of the door. I went under my covers. I felt him near me. I peeked out, and he was right at my bedside. I don't know if he was looking at me or not, due to not being able to distinguish features, but I flew back under and didn't come out. Next day, we all talked about it, and apparently he went to each of our beds and inspected us. They both saw him looking in my direction. Then the other roommates saw him do it to them too. I will never forget that. Staring at me. I saw him every night for 6 months. When I was around 11 or 12, I thought it was sleep paralysis for a while, until one night I was uncomfortable in the position I was in and sat up to adjust my pillow. I spent a minute or two getting comfortable, looked over, and he was still there, just staring at me. I remember waking up around 3 a.m. every night and staring at him until I passed out again. I don't know how I managed to fall asleep with him there, though. Thanks for the nightmares. I couldn't believe it when I heard other people had experienced this. I saw this figure many times in my childhood home. There was a presence felt often by my family members that lived there, usually on the corner of the stairs. The staircase has a landing between a set of about 8 steps each. I'd seen him a couple times near the stairs, or in a reflection of them from the living room's double doors. The time that struck me the most was seeing him upstairs in my little brother's room. As I walked, I saw a tall, dark figure just standing there, facing to the right, toward the window in the empty room. I don't ever remember seeing a face, though. When I found out other people have experienced it too, I sent my brother a link. He thanked me for the nightmares. A sign? I have valuable information on Hatman, and it could be 100% true. I was reading about a person who had 3 dreams about him. They had a theory he could be a harbinger of change. When I personally experienced his visit, I had just been introduced to alcohol. The person I was reading about had started a new medication. He visited me while intoxicated, and I saw him physically. Then later, in my dream. When I saw him next to where I sleep, I felt no fear. No fear at all. But when my dream started, the most horrific feeling I've ever had overcame me. I never drank after that, and I haven't seen him since. Though he can be a symbol of change, I haven't figured out what kind of change he represents. That's where people share their stories and figure out more about where he came from and how he moves. Here are some things that I know for sure. He'll visit you in a conscious dream state. He will not physically harm you in person, but he will attack you in your dreams, and he can assume different forms. While I'm writing this, I'm remembering more of what happened in my dream, and I remember passing out at his feet after I tried to cast him out. After that, I woke up in a dark alleyway where a wave of pure evil and darkness made my entire body shake. My blood ran cold, and every hair stood up on the back of my neck, 1,000 times worse than any kind of ordinary experience of fear. Hatman's pet? He came out of my closet every day for a month when I was 3. He was translucent and sometimes had a bulldog with him. It was surreal since it happened at 2 in the morning every night. We'd run down crying that a man was in the closet. My parents swear up and down that they never told us about ghosts. But my brother and I still saw it. A closer look at Hatman. I've seen him twice, both times as an adult, both without any medications, drugs, or alcohol. He had the trench coat and the fedora. His collar was pulled up. The collar popped, and I never got a great look at his face. What little glimpses I caught looked like white or cream fabric. When the movie came out, I realized Rorschach from The Watchmen looked pretty damn close to what I saw. I'm pretty sure he was yelling something at me in both dreams, but I don't remember what. Both dreams were essentially the same, with minor changes. One house, many witnesses. My experience with Hatman came in 1994, when I was about 14 years old. I was living with my grandmother and great-grandmother at the time at my home in Nashville, Tennessee. I had been staying up really late that night, and at about 2 in the morning, I found myself lying in bed and nodding off with the TV on. The lights were all off, and the only light that was lighting my room was coming from the TV in front of me. Looking down toward my feet, I had a clear view all the way into and through my great-grandmother's room, which was just parallel to mine, as there was no door between my room and hers. I could also see into the hallway just on the far side of her room. Just inside the hallway was the doorway going into my grandmother's room. As I was lying there dozing off, with the covers pulled up to my face, my eyes would open and fall, over and over again. And then, at some point, something I heard on TV made a noise and caused me to wake up and open my eyes a little wider. Only this time I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I'd always worried about what I would do if someone ever broke into our home. For a brief moment I thought that the movement I was seeing might be my grandmother, but as I moved my eyes more into focus, looking down through my great-grandmother's room into the hallway, I quickly realized it wasn't her. What I saw gripped me immediately with fear and dread. I saw a tall, human-like figure, and the figure looked like a man. The man had no distinguishable features. I could see no eyes, no nose, nor mouth, only blackness. He looked like a shadow, only darker, much darker. He had a very wide, brimmed hat and a long trench coat that flowed as he moved. I started to tremble. My heart began to race. At that moment I came to the conviction that there was indeed an intruder. As I watched him move, in the back of my mind I began to play out scenarios. Was I going to yell? Was I going to get up and run after him and try to fight him? I kept looking into the hallway. He stood there at the threshold between my great-grandmother's room and my grandmother's room. He leaned his head and body into my great-grandmother's room and looked in, turning his head toward her and then toward me. I had my eyes closed as much as I could, so I could still see him and yet still look like I was sleeping. He stood there for what seemed like an eternity, just staring. He then moved very slowly and without sound back into the hallway, just out of view. As I kept watching, I then saw this blacker than black figure move toward my grandmother's room. Just like before, he leaned his body and head into her doorway, looking at her, again not making a sound. He then leaned back and moved out of view into the hallway. At this point I didn't know what to do. I was convinced that we had a burglar, so I summoned all the courage I could, jumped up out of bed yelling, and charged into the hallway, ready for a fight. I turned the hallway and he was gone. My yelling and screaming startled and woke my grandmother and great-grandmother. I told them what had happened, and, needless to say, we didn't go back to sleep for a long time. And when we did, we left the lights on. That night and the next day, I spent a lot of time talking with my family about what had happened. I was surprised to know that my experience of the man with the hat and cape was not the only one that had happened in that house. As it turned out, both my grandmother and great-grandmother had seen the same thing. My grandmother relayed to me that a few nights prior she had woken in the middle of the night and also saw a dark figure walk past her doorway in the dim light of the hallway. Since it looked like it was wearing some kind of flowing robe, she thought it was her mother, my great-grandmother, getting up to go to the bathroom. Then my great-grandmother told me that on a separate occasion she had seen the same dark shadow lurking in the house. I honestly didn't know what to make of it all. And over the years I grew antagonistic towards the whole thing, brushing it off as happenstance, a figment of my imagination, or perhaps the result of my nodding off and being in that in-between place, half awake and half asleep. I thought about it every now and then, but relegated it to the back part of my mind, paying little attention to it. I would continue to feel this way about the experience until about 2001. I was driving a long distance one night and hitting the scan button to see if I could find something to listen to on the radio. The station landed on 1310 WLAC on a show called Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie. It was probably 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. when the show came on. They were doing a show on what they called shadow beings. It was the first time I had ever heard of something like that. As I listened, nothing could prepare me for what I heard. George Norrie and the guest went on to describe people's experiences with one particular shadow being, a dark, man-like figure with a large, wide-brimmed hat and a cape. Immediately, chills ran down my spine. I knew at that moment that what had happened was not a figment of my imagination, and was definitely not the result of my nodding off. I had seen what these people were describing. Exactly. Hatman woke me from sleep. I recently discovered that others have seen Hatman, and I feel a great sense of relief knowing that my childhood experiences with this entity were not just singular figments of my imagination. Back in the early 1990s, when I was between the ages of 10 and 12, I was asleep on my side, with my back to the side of the bed, when I felt someone tap my shoulder, causing me to wake up. As I turned around, I saw a shadowy figure with a top hat standing over my bed. Alarmed and filled with fear, I started screaming at the top of my lungs. I continued to scream while Hatman started smiling and laughing at me with a wide grin, resembling the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. My mom eventually came into my room and turned on the lights, causing him to disappear. My sister, who was sleeping in the room next to mine, said that my screams were like nothing she had ever heard from me before, and thought I was being murdered. Since that night, there have been other strange occurrences, but Hatman has not reappeared, thankfully. At the time, I was unsure of what to make of this experience, as the grin seemed cartoonish, and I could not understand why the entity was wearing a top hat. It made me question whether I had really seen it. However, I know that I was fully awake and terrified, and not in any kind of sleep state. I am grateful to know now that others have seen similar things, including the crazy grin.